Are you ready?
Go for it.
Okay. My name is Robert Franklin. I'm conducting an oral history interview with Dennis Armstrong on May 24th, 2017. The interview is being conducted on the campus of Washington State University, Tri-Cities. I'll be talking with Dennis about his experiences working at the Hanford site. And for the record, can you state and spell your full name for us?
Dennis A. Armstrong, Armstrong, Dennis, middle initial A.
Okay, great. So Dennis, how and why did you come to the area to work for Hanford?
Well, I've thought about what kind of answer it might take to really answer that, and it probably goes clear back to high school days.
Okay.
And I did something along with four other friends. Went to an open house that the Washington International Guard had in Spokane, and I ended up joining the group.
Okay.
Got assigned into a aircraft maintenance group and learned how to like airplanes. And at that time, the Washington Air Guard was a fighter squadron, very close-knit group of wonderful people that I was proud to be associated with for 6 years. Reason that kind of influenced why I came to Hanford is because all through my 4.5 years at Washington State University Pullman in mechanical engineering, I had it in my mind that I was going to go to work for somebody making airplanes. And in my senior year, as campus interviews were underway, and those times was not unusual for almost all the big companies to come to campus to do interviews. Mm-hmm. Not so nowadays, but at that time I picked out aircraft companies, and I got some pretty good offers. Know airplanes, know how they work, know how they get put together, and I got even some exceptionally good salary offers. I showed them to my advisor, and he said, "Dennis, you're a pretty independent thinker. Just to tell me you did it, go talk to at least 2 or 3 other companies besides aircraft people." So I go up to look at the campus interview schedule, and I picked out 2 or 3 companies, including a scheduled interview from John Electric. Not knowing whether GE made toasters or waffle irons or what, wherever I was going to be interviewed from, I went in kind of blind and found out it was a representative from Hanford.
Ah.
And it happened that in my work at the Washington Air Guard in the maintenance shops, I enjoyed metalworking, including, I was primarily doing sheet metal work and aircraft structure work. And we had a couple nice lathes that I enjoyed working with, just nothing else to learn how to work them. And I ended up getting a job at the Department of Mechanical Engineers 2 years running as senior laboratory instructor in a machine shop. So expanding on that, I did a special senior project on the machinability of metals. So that came up in the course of my interview with Doug Tilson, who was the representative from GE, and he says, "I've got exactly that job right now. I need a candidate for it. We want to hire people into our tech grad program," they called it, "and yet I'll promise you a machining research job, first assignment, if you choose to come with us." So they sent me a letter, and not quite the high salary I had from the aircraft people, but I showed these to my advisor, and he says, "That's a given, take it." So I went back, and it happened that in the dorm that I had lived in, I had a couple of friends whose parents had worked at Hanford, so I knew a little teeny bit about it, never been here. And one time, one of them brought me over to Richland before I ended up accepting the GE offer. And at that time, of course, GE was still the predominant employer at Hanford, and I saw nothing of what really going on at Hanford, but I learned a little bit about Richland and kind of liked it. And having grown up in Spokane, I thought, why on earth do I want to go to Los Angeles and work for North American Aviation on airplanes when I've got something right close in Washington State? And they offered me a job that was right in a piece of line of work that I had enjoyed, and I wrote them a letter and said, I'll take it. I went through a couple questions like, tell me more about this machining research job. And they said, well, we've looked at your paper, and I've even showed it to the people doing it, and they would like to have you come, but that's about all we can tell you. Okay. Well, I showed these papers to my advisor, and he says, that's a given. Take it.
So sorry, I'd like to just, the second time you said that, and I wrote that down because I wanted to explore that further. Why did your advisor feel that that was a given?
Oh, well, he went on to say, I've been in the aircraft industry, very structured engineering. You're an independent thinker. Get in with some company that's not quite as structured as the aircraft industry is. And I had no way of knowing other than to listen to him. And then couple that with the fact that here I had an offer close by, home was still Spokane, and kind of pieced it together, and my advisor knew those links and kind of felt that this would be a good placement for me.
And were you from Spokane originally?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's how I ended up in the Washington Air Guard in Spokane, because I'd gone to high school in Spokane and wheat farming country south of Spokane.
Yep. Okay, so describe coming to Hanford.
Well, I show up, and here there's 50 other brand new hires, and we all report into the building, and I forget the number downtown. It was in the old 700 area. It was GE New Employee Processing, and I was found out I was the only one that had been already named to an assignment. And they had the greases on the skids, and I was given a badge and said, tomorrow morning you'll report out to this place out in the edge of the earth called 200 West area, to a building called 231Z. And I had no clue what that meant, or even what the assignment was yet. But they described and spent all the rest of the balance of that day in terms of processing in and getting papers signed and all the stuff that goes with orientation. The next morning, a fellow named Tom Nelson, who was supervisor of metallurgy development, eventually became Battelle, but for General Electric, metallurgy development operation in 231Z building. He came downtown, picked me up, took me out to 231Z building. And I met a fellow there who was assigned to do a project. His name was John Rector. And I learned that I was to produce a document on the machinability state-of-the-art of machining plutonium metal. And I'd, of course, never heard of plutonium metal before. I got my top secret clearance at that time, and they took me over to 234.5 through the production line, and I saw what the whole purpose of Hanford was all about, and making parts. At that time we made weapon pieces here. Not commonly advertised today, but it was not secret then, and still isn't. But
what kinds of weapon pieces were made?
The plutonium core for the thermonuclear devices.
Okay, and so, but before, how long had Hanford been making weapon pieces?
The history goes, of course you well know from your study of the origin of Hanford, it was to make plutonium metal to be sent to Los Alamos for assembly into the Nagasaki weapon.
Right.
they continued to make them at Los Alamos up until like 1949, which time this famous 234-5, or now called plutonium finishing, that was a name given to the plant later. That was built solely for the purpose of converting the plutonium nitrate to metal, and metal, they call them buttons, the product, buttons into cast pieces and machined pieces for the weapon cores. And that started in like 1949-50 here at Hanford. And then a few years later, they built a parallel plant at Rocky Flats. And yet, I think in the early years, best I knew, Hanford made 3/4 of the production. Rocky Flats a little less than a quarter. Still, Los Alamos made a few, but the stockpile was primarily made at Hanford. And then the balance started shifting a little more to Rocky Flats until mid-'60s, when all the production went to Rocky Flats. Well, anyway, back to my pathway. Here I was being told to learn all there is to know and put it down in a document on machining plutonium metal. And they had a fella out from General Electric Schenectady who was a machining expert, and he had just left to go back to GE, and he was concentrating on traditional big production like tooling forces and horsepower to make cuts. I walked through the production line, and they wanted emphasis on accuracy, not what the program was gearing toward. They wanted emphasis on surface finish. And I turned around the program being done by metallurgy research people and ended up putting out a document on how to get the finest surface finish we can be able to do with the lathes they had in 234-5 building, which happened to be some of the finest that existed in the world. So I wrote that document. It happens to still be classified. I'll never see it again. Yeah, that leads me to a thought on classifications at Hanford. I didn't understand it at the time, but now I do. I used to think weapon design was the big secret. It really wasn't. It happened at Hanford. Production rate was the big secret, and manufacturing technology was right behind it. So we physically protected manufacturing technology higher than the design of the devices, which is what you see nowadays in how close is Iran to making one. And you can bet you they're farther ahead than our politicians think they are. Anyway, enough said. I put in 4 months writing that document, got published, and a fellow named Les Brecky, who ran the production line in 234-5, invited me to come over and spend an assignment there, still on the GE Tech Grad program. I had a friend that had wanted me to come and spend an assignment with the K-reactor design group, too. And I thought, well, I've been in one thing. I think I'll take the K-reactor design group. And I did that down 762 building through the winter, so I didn't have to go out to Hanford during the winter that first year. And I participated in designing a flexible horizontal control rod for the K-reactors. Was eventually fabricated and put in. At that time, operating problems with reactors was secret. You've actually got one of these flexible rods in your inventory at the museum backups storeroom. And I've got one of the 3-hole pieces of boron carbide that go in it, because I ended up making those pieces later. Wow. I'll get to that in a second. That was a fun assignment in terms of really designing a product and getting it approved and getting through design approval from the rather rigorous design approval process. So then I talked to Les Brecky again and said, "You still want me?" And he said, "Absolutely. I'll take you any time you can get here." And I ended up as my third assignment then on the GE Tech Grad program of going to production line 234.5 building. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just for those that may not be, including sometimes myself, who may not be well versed in the numbering system or acronyms of the building, what is so earlier you said 231Z, and
231Z was an original building that DuPont built to process the plutonium nitrate, and when that was moved over to the Purex building and then 234.5, which I'll describe a little more later, the 231 building was turned into a metallurgy development laboratory.
Okay.
And that eventually became a branch of Battelle when GE diversified.
And so 234.5, does that have a more common name?
Well, the more common name is plutonium finishing plant.
Okay, so that is the PFP.
PFP, and yet that name, interestingly, wasn't coined until after the weapons mission.
Okay.
The original, it was just called 234.5 or -5 or Z plant.
Okay.
Never had a word name associated with it.
Okay.
It held a special clearance. To even get in the door, you had to have, it was kind of a soft top secret clearance called a blue tag clearance. And you've got a model of one of these badges there in your museum. Today no one carries that clearance anymore, but that's what it was access to weapon data processing.
Okay. My last question, what year did you come to him?
1963, June of 63.
You came in 1963?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to establish
and that was, I guess, going clear back to the beginning of the story when I joined the Air Guard while I was still in high school. That was like the 1958 time frame, see?
Okay.
So all through my WSU time frame, as I was in the Air Guard, thinking of going to work for aircraft people, and it wasn't until 62 or so that I started in the interview process to where to eventually take permanent employment. And then that pathway that I described on the interview from General Electric Company here, it turned out to be here, but I didn't know it at the time.
Gotcha. Okay.
So here I am now in the, it was called Weapons Manufacturing Operation.
And this was with
General Electric Company.
with Les
Brecky.
With Les Brecky. Okay.
And so we did two things. We were the receiver of the plutonium button, which is the finished plutonium chunk coming from a simple term called the button line, which is part of the production of in this Z plant, or 234.5 building, across the wall into the machining. And her first casting, we cast it, it's a metal, just like you can cast and pour any other lead, brass, bronze, iron. Process is quite similar. Cast it into a shape, machine it to a final product, pack and go through inspection and package it and send it to the assembly plant.
And where was the assembly plant?
They went first to Rocky Flats in Denver, and then down to Pantex in Texas, where the final assemblies were all put together.
Right. Okay. And so how sorry, go ahead.
So my job on it was, the name of the group was called Weapons Fabrication, and my job was to overview machining. They had just bought a set of very fine lathes that didn't quite work as good as they thought they should. And first job was figure out why. And it was a kind of a combination electronics problem and hydraulics problem that I think I solved, because we made them work. And so through 63, 64, 65, I was in charge of those lathes, pumping out parts that went to inspection and then eventually shipped. And I enjoyed it. I really did. I didn't realize how good a job it was until it was all over. And one of the saddest things I had to do in the course of my career, we were setting with literally a 5-year top secret plan of production, how many parts we were going to make every month for 5 years, and it went to zero overnight.
Mm. And why was that?
Politics.
And what year, when was that?
Mid 65, late 65. And I can't tell you the politics of it, but the idea was save some money by shifting all the production and casting and machining over to Rocky Flats. Mm. Close down Hanford production. And so that hit the newspaper, and that we were in one of the first major cutbacks at Hanford. And it happened that the person I'd worked with in 231 building, John Rector, had a hobby doing manufacturing in his basement. And of course, it wasn't by the first weekend I was over to his house, seeing what he was doing, and he was doing stuff in his basement that was beyond a lot of capability of big production shops. He came to me and said, "We're out of a job." I was promised a position in the maintenance group. I didn't quite know how I wanted to do that. I'm sure I could have negotiated something into design engineering, but John said, been my plan someday to start a full-time business. And if you want to partner with me, let's do it. And we did, and we operated out of his basement for 3-4 months while we built Western Centering Company. It's over on Stevens Drive, still running today. So I turned in my resignation to GE, and we started Western Centering Company, and I enjoyed it. I truthfully enjoyed the independence of a small business for 7 years. And I'm still good friends with the people that run it today, including the family. I left under good pretense, and the reason I left was Atlantic Richfield. The employment relations, a fellow named Bill Watson came to me and said, we need an engineering manager for East area, West area. Oh, you've been selected to be the first offer. Oh, interesting. I had never mailed out a resume or anything. I was selected by some friends that when the opening was there, they scrubbed a bunch of names and came to me and said, the job is yours if you want it. And I took it. So I became engineering manager of East area and West area, plant engineering.
What was so attractive about the job that you wanted? Working
with people. Think I saw this particularly in the production line in 234-5 building. I was frequently, being the fabrication engineer of a production operation where we had rotating shifts with 5 different supervisors. I was the guy that ended up as shift relief now and then. And we had the finest operators that existed at Hanford. They were all hand-selected, good people. And I enjoyed working with them. They were all good to work with. And so I thought, here, I got a chance to work with engineers. And at first I was put into a group that had about 8 engineers. And then I took over from Walt Ingalls, who had chosen to retire under Atlantic Richfield shingle, and took over a larger group of close to 75 people, wow, including plant engineering for each of their established operating plants. And at that time, we were still running Purex and B plant and 234-5. You asked about the plutonium finishing name to Z-Plant, and that was done as kind of a last ditch after our weapons mission was done. Rename the plant, try to get some other business here. And we did several projects. We did a couple of plutonium fabrication test ingots for the Navy, and we did some plutonium heat source things for NASA. And we took in half a dozen jobs in that plant. We even made the first of the Sable units for the Army, the ones they fired over in Iraq. And those happened to have been secret when we made them. But then later they come out, the uranium Sable units for the artillery shells, or tank cannons. Mm-hmm. Anyway, that was the approach to naming it plutonium finishing, as advertising capability out to the world that we could handle plutonium. And there really was no other capability. But the bottom line, there wasn't very many people who wanted to go out and hire that kind of work done either. So,
right, but especially with the Cold War being over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It wasn't until 5 or 6 years later that the plutonium uranium mixed oxide fast reactor fuel business came into play. Otherwise, that would have been a natural for takeover by that building. But it wasn't understood then. So at Western Centering, like I say, I enjoyed it. And we made our own machinery.
And what did you primarily make?
Small mechanical parts, cold compaction of metal powders into a shape. And the sintering process is... The sintering process is a furnace to diffusion bond the cold compacted metal powders into a finished structural piece. In terms of things common folk think of, little gears, little bushings, little bearings, little, I say little because we were somewhat limited by size. The bigger the part, the bigger the press. We had made our own up to 200 ton, and that could make a part of about 2 or 3 square inches surface area. Otherwise, little parts can make them pretty fast on a small 10-ton press. We actually made some 10-ton presses for the nuclear fuels industry, primarily the Westinghouse and General Electric, and even Areva out here. Back then, there were General Electric, Jersey Nuclear. And we sold 34 of those things around the world, including 4 of them to India and 2 of them up to Canada. And pretty well established a name in terms of a good operating machine for that particular industry. As I say, Lank Richfield came to me and offered me the job of plant engineering manager, which I took. And at that time, the B plant fuels, or excuse me, the strontium cesium encapsulation plant was just in final design stage and not working very good. Happened that Les Brecky had been assigned over to that building, and here I was, previous good stand with him, and suddenly I'm in charge of making his equipment that didn't work again, which we did do as a group, team. Ended up packaging the whole inventory of strontium cesium capsules that's now in the reservoir. It's been sitting there for 50 years now. Oh. 40 years. Anyway, however. So at that time, Lank Richfield was a pretty good contractor to work for. I even ranked Lank Richfield a little higher than General Electric in terms of wanting their people to understand they worked for Lank Richfield. Had good relations there. And if they'd have stayed contractor, I'd probably stayed there. It happened that they chose 10 years as the contract limit, and Rockwell, new contractor. And a couple things happened at Rockwell outside of Hanford. The B-1 bomber went down the tube when Jimmy Carter canceled the project. And so, and another company they had called Atomics International was doing reactor research to eventually build some gas-cooled reactors. That was pretty much down the tube. So Rockwell sat there with two sources of their own people. They brought in quite a few to Hanford. And I was told that my job would be replaced by one of them. And I could go to project management, which I did. And I didn't care for the project management because I enjoyed the design work of, and particularly the kind of design work we were doing, which is plant troubleshooting. Every week we'd have a plant managers meeting of all the different site plants, and whoever was in trouble, I could solve it, and I could put my team onto it and solve it the way we were set up to do it. And I laugh at the current problem of the Purex tunnel collapsing, because I had an exactly the same issue happen back in the 70s. It happened there were a bunch of low-level waste disposal units called cribs. There were stacked Douglas fir timber underground, meant to be just a big void space to send low-level liquid waste. And people out monitoring the desert where these cribs were came back with a report over the weekend that one of these cribs had collapsed, not far from the story of the Purex tunnel last week. And so I'm at the plant managers meeting, and this is the big flap for the week. Why did this happen, and what are we going to do about it? So I came back and put one of my good civil engineers on it, and he came back in about 10 minutes and said, good news and bad news. Good news, I know why, and bad news, every one of them's going to collapse. Oh, tell me more. Well, these were stacked Douglas fir timber. You got about 40 years on untreated timber, and then it's going to be weak enough to rot away and they'll collapse. Okay, what are we going to do about it? Well, we're going to fill up the holes. So that was our carryover to the plant manager. And so we eventually came up with the process to slurry up sand and pump it down every one of these holes, and we eventually breached some of them. Problem was, you see, the rodents would get down into a hole, and then they'd eat the strontium salts that were in this low-level waste, and they'd come up, and the rabbits would eat the rodents, and then the coyotes would eat the rabbits, and then you'd have hot spots around in the desert, and that was bad news. So we ended up vacuuming the desert, and that was a legend to live down. Anyway, I thought about Purex tunnel, because I knew how that one was made, and I thought surely those timbers are rotted away, and it's exactly the same story. The only answer is fill them with sand. And then what are you going to do about it? And of course the plan that's somewhat out in the newspaper is fill them with slurry, probably a grout mix.
Well, it's all in the Purex tunnel. It's all solid waste, right?
No, there's no waste in there at all.
Or it's contaminated solid objects.
That's a good way to put it. The object of the design at Purex plant, in the earlier fuel separations plant, Radox, T plant, B plant, whenever a failed big vessel or big pump would have to be disposed of, they'd put it on a rail car, drag it out near the desert, drag it out to the burial ground, and bury it. Actually, time-consuming plus potential for accidents and exposure. So the idea at the Purex plant was build a tunnel at the head end of the plant, And then you got a failed pump, failed tank. You buy an old railroad car that's junk, put the pump on it, and send it down this railroad tunnel for somebody to worry about someday. There's no waste in there other than whatever residual was on the contaminated equipment.
Right.
But there still could be some pretty high-level stuff.
Because of what it
was handling, sure.
But no
actual waste like we think of the waste in the waste tanks or waste like the strontium cesium capsules in B plant.
Did you see the infographic that the Washington State Department of Ecology had put out of the tunnels, and it had the rail cars, but inside the rail cars was a green goo?
I didn't see that.
Oh, you
probably wouldn't have got impressed with it. I'm personally don't like the state being a regulator. I think it should have been kept as a federal agency, but that's my own opinion that they wouldn't care for today. I don't think the state's got any business being in that business. Enough said.
Okay.
That's not a popular area.
So that's good.
You can edit that out.
Well, I mean, it's just an opinion.
Yeah.
So you had worked on these cribs, and filled them up with
slurry of sand and stuff. Yeah.
So were these constructed similarly to the Purex tunnel?
They were a hole in the ground with I forget what they were, like 20-foot long timbers stacked just to make a big void space, and then a roof over the top and 6-8 foot of dirt on top of it.
Okay.
The whole idea was to get a big void space down underground to pump low-level liquid waste. But over years of pumping low-level waste in, it accumulates to high-level waste, and that's why it was bad to have the rodents down in there eating these salts.
Sure.
So anyway, with Rockwell coming in and me going to project management, I had another group of people come to me, namely Washington Public Power. We would like you to come with us. We're building 5 nuclear power plants. And I said, well, I'll be there. And so I took a job, project management of what was called equipment qualification, namely to prove everything in the reactor was everything safety related was really going to work during every credible accident. We had about 20,000 electrical, mechanical pieces of equipment. We had definitive proof they could stand the accident scenario. So still involved at Hanford and watching it, but yet direct employment left when I left Rockwell.
Okay. But it's still obviously still related.
So, still nuclear power plant as opposed to waste management area or production in the early years.
And how long were you with Whoops?
18 years.
Okay. So you kind of saw then the full, the rise and fall, I guess one could say.
Oh, yeah. In fact, even in organizational dynamics, this was a tough time. Organization staging for, I guess if you think of plant construction, you need one craft for some time, or one set of engineers for some period, and another set of engineers for another period. And we had organizations that were struggling with trying to keep their mission alive. When Don Major, who was our general manager then, was trying his best to say, this organization's got to phase down because this one's phasing up to finish the plant. But the thing that I saw my pathway pretty clear. I was kind of middle management through my whole career path. And here in middle management in the Washington Public Power supply system, we could see a clear pathway to make that plant work. Something bothers me about the VIT plant. People working on it aren't going to see it work in the lifetime of the people working on it. That's why I don't like the idea of the state being involved in it. That should have been a small demonstration plant. Could have been finished 5 years ago and working, and if it worked good, we'd build 2 or 3 more of them.
Mm. Instead of building one.
State kept insisting it's got to be so big that once we turn it on, we'll run all the waste through it and be done. They ended up building it so big that they couldn't control the design process, and still don't know when it's going to run. May never run.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are other ideas on what to do with waste, and some of them still being explored to maybe speed it up. But Savannah River has a waste evaporator and a waste melter. Not the titanium industry's had titanium vacuum melters for years. We could have made one here.
Savannah River is also partway through their vitrification process, but
Yeah.
there though it's easier because the chemical they only used one, or they used less chemical separations processes than we did, so
Yeah.
they have much less complicated waste.
I understand that too, and this is one of the things that even took me a long time to digest when I had Plant Engineering Group over the tank farms and Purex and Radox and those, that each one put out a different product in terms of the waste composition and the process to handle it somewhat different. But even in the years I was there, we were running the T evaporator and the S evaporator, and then the A evaporator was built just after I left, and they were all one mission: take the waste out of the tanks. It was done before I got there to take all the strontium cesium out, and that was done very quietly and successfully. So getting stuff out of the tanks was not a big deal. They knew how to do it, and suddenly it's got to be reinvented.
Yeah.
And even running the S evaporator and the T evaporator, they were different processes, but we took a lot of water out and made a lot of space in the tanks. Some of them, they gained a little too much space, and they had to put water back in to cool it down. But that's part of the learning process.
It was meant that liquid waste would go in the tanks, right? So now that it's been largely solidified, doesn't that make it harder to access the tanks via the existing pipes?
Well, it sure does.
It
sure does. And in the first campaign of effectively what was in there was liquids, and yet a lot of stuff had settled out over the years. And as they were extracting the product out of the tanks, they had some kind of pumps to get the liquid out, and then it's some devices they called sluicers, which would spray the tank bottoms, loosen up stuff so they could slurry it up and pump it on into B plant to process. Still, they cleaned the tanks out tolerably well, and yet the evaporator process included a type of pump called a salt well that we made in my plant engineering group, where we'd literally put a well casing not far from what you see out in the desert for farming, put a well casing down the tank so you could sift away from the salt product and get the liquid back out and send it to the evaporators. So every one of the tanks went through this salt well campaign of extracting liquids to try and get it solid. So this leaves a little different product to get out of there now. And at that time, the idea was remote shovels and stuff like that to dig it out. And that, I think, was demonstrated doable. And yet concurrently, we had almost the same game that they've got now. I'd get a call over the weekend, this tank's potential leaker just got a high dry well indication, what should we do? And we come up with a plan to route piping and pump it over to another tank, and we think that one's good, so we'll try that one for a while, and yeah, that one seems to be holding it. And then we had a big master chart of, and this was before computers could take care of things to count for you, but we had a big chart of which tanks would suspected leakers, known leakers, possible leakers, and 3 or 4 other categories of maybe they're okay or maybe not, and we got space here but not there. Same game that you read about in the paper today.
Right.
But a little different product to have to handle. I do admit that. My own desires, and yet I was current plant operations, plant engineering, and Don Woodrich, another group, was long-range planning. What are we going to do with this stuff eventually? And that time it was dig it out and put it in casks and take it someplace. No one wanted it.
That's a hard sell.
Yeah.
It was what years was that?
That was in the mid-'70s.
Okay.
Because I left Rockwell. Rockwell came in, and I guess I'm going to say the early '80s.
Okay.
And that's when I left and went to Washington Public Power.
And how? So you were then with Washington Public Power until kind of its ending.
Well, through actually got caught in layoff. They wanted head count and they wanted dollars, and now the 4 plants were put in first a construction delay and then eventual termination, and it was clear that we had too many people, and the general manager had a stroke and they hired a new guy. He come in and said, get me a list of the high dollar people in engineering because we're going to contract out a lot of this business. And I was one of the higher paid engineers or managers, and I got hit with the layoff in the mid-'90s.
And so what did you do? What did you do after leaving Whoops?
Retired. I chose it to be an early retirement.
Okay.
And I've been active all along in the leadership of American Society of Mechanical Engineers. And so I spent a lot of time there, still do.
Great. Let's see here. You've answered a lot of my questions, but I have a few more. What were the most challenging and or rewarding aspects of your work at Hanford?
Early years, like I mentioned, being selected to go into the weapons production group, and that wasn't a group you got into very easily. The best operators and the best supervisors existed at Hanford. We had the final mission, make parts, put them in a box, and ship them. And I worked there for over 4 years for Les Brecky. It was a tough one to work for. Never missed a single shipment.
Wow. And what about the later years?
In Lank Richfield years, same story. I had a wonderful group of people. Had 5 subsections in my plant engineering group, specifically one for each plant. But I had them all structured so they knew if I was in trouble someplace with whatever it be, I could draw from one group and put it into another group to get through a complicated problem. And we had some issues with the evaporators, and with the tank farms were a constant headache. And even Pyrex, when they started to shut it down and then ramp it up for what was to be the last run, I somehow, the production manager was a fellow named Chuck Malady, and I ended up being his ghostwriter for letters that went to it was Energy Research and Development Administration, now DOE. I wrote 2 letters from President of Lank Richfield to DOE, or then ERDA. Please let us run Pyrex one more time, we'll be done with that end reactor fuel forever. Twice the answer came back, no, can't do it. Please don't ask again because Jimmy Carter wants no more waste in the waste tanks. Instead, they let the fuel rot away in the K-reactor basins. We were campaigning, let us run Purex. We could have done it and been done with it, would not have added that much waste. But that was a decision made at the presidential level that was probably cost this country $100 billion. And we're still not willing to admit it. They still haven't got the mess cleaned up. And we had Purex ready to go to do it.
Right, right. Interesting. Thank you. What are some of your memories of any major events in Tri-Cities history? I guess, for example, were you around for President Kennedy's visit?
Yeah, in fact, it was kind of comical because I was working in the production line, and the message that came out is essential operations must continue, but non-essential people will be released to go to President Kennedy's visit. And there'll be buses to bus you down there. And Les Brecky had maintained we were essential, so we weren't going to go. And then he had a change of heart the last day, said, well, I want to keep my operators busy, but Armstrong and 2 or 3 others, you can get on the bus and go. So I was way back in the last row of the last bus that came in, and I watched from way back afar, and it was fun to see it.
Yeah.
And
do you remember President Nixon's visit?
Oh, I do, but I actually didn't. I wasn't here. I was traveling someplace, and so I didn't get in on the festivities.
Any other major events in Tri-Cities history? Plant shutdowns, startups that kind of stand out to you?
Well, certainly the contractor changes, and even one of the comical end parts of with General Electric, I worked directly for Les Brecky, and he had a rather seriously assembled dossier on every one of his people, and I forget who it was that came out from, it might have been George Saylor from General Electric, who was high up in the employee relations group. He says, your secretary tells us you're not going to release your files. You must turn them in. That's GE property. That's not your property. Everyone will start with an empty folder when Blank Richfield comes in. And well, actually, it wasn't the Blank Richfield. It was an interim company called Isochem, who was a rather short-lived vendor. They were supposed to build an isotope separations plant, never did, and then Blank Richfield got that contract assigned to him. Interesting style then, but anyway, bottom line is that was kind of a comical thing. I sit out in the outside of the row, and then George Saylor comes out. He was in. I was outside of his office. My office was from here to the wall from his, and I could hear him arguing. You must release your employee files because those are GE property, not yours. Well, he eventually had to. So we started with an empty binder on everyone, but I think he kept a few things out of there. But that was kind of an interesting thing. Another fun one that happened about still with Les Brecky, I mentioned I'd been active all along in ASME, local and national activities. Well, it happened that another fella in 234-5 building came to me and said, hey, I see you just moved to town. Would you help us with our local section meetings? I said, oh, yeah, sure. What do you want me to do? Well, here's 10 names. You call these 10 members and remind them of our next meeting. I can do that. So I put the list in my drawer, and come a week before the meeting, I pull it out and start calling people and get down about 4 names, and there was the boss's boss on the list. Me, little guy on the totem pole, gonna call him. I'll skip his name. And then I called the rest, and then I put the list back in my drawer, and the next day I said, hey, I promised Marv I'd call these people. I guess I'll do it. So I called him up. He answers the phone to himself. You Warren here. Oh, want to remind you of our ASME meeting coming up this week. Oh, yeah, I got that notice. I'm going to be there. Put me down. And he remained a lifelong friend forever.
Wow.
And the comical thing that happened is he says, where do you work? I said, 234-5 work. I work for Les Brecky. Oh, I'm coming down there this afternoon. I'll stop in and say hello. So my office door was within viewing door of Les Brecky's office door. And in comes boss's boss, said hello to me, and we talked a few minutes, and he left. Psst, Brecky comes out. What was Warren down here? Oh, he just popped in and said hello. Enough said. Anyway, it's just kind of a comical event. And there are probably hundreds of examples like that through the years. Sure. Like I say, when I had the plant engineering group, I had wonderful people working for me. And some of them, unfortunately, were older than I was, and we read about one of them every weekend now. Yeah, they're passing away.
Yeah, that's true. What was it like living in Richland? So you would have moved here after Richland had become privatized. What was it like living in Richland in that area of the Cold War in the 60s and 70s?
I can't say that there was anything spectacular. Downtown, well, I had an apartment when I moved into Richland across from the old Cadillac Hospital, and it was one block over to what was called 700 area, which they were just building the federal building and knocking down all the old federal building offices. Mm-hmm. So I had that K-reactor design group assignment was in 762 building, which I'd walk half a block from my apartment into the gate on the north end of the 700 area and walked 2 buildings to my, and I didn't know much about what else was going on down there other than it was most of design engineering for the whole site. I was specific to K-reactor, and we were in one building. You talked about Kennedy. Even going back to college, had an interesting experience with him. I lived in a dormitory the first couple of years, and I guess it must have been like 1959 or 60. It was a Saturday, and I was on phone duty. We had one phone come into the dorm. You'd answer it and then call a room, somebody. Well, if they were holding what they called a mock political convention. And I wasn't going to go to it, but in comes this call from somebody, hey, we're the state of Massachusetts, and we got a big deal guy here, and he's senator, and we've only got 2 people to represent our state. Send people over here. So I could put out a message on the public announcement to the whole dorm, and then my shift was coming to the end, and I decided I gathered 3 or 4 other people, and we went over to the gymnasium to be part of the Massachusetts convention for this political convention. The famous senator was John Kennedy. We sat around, 8 of us around the room, around the circle, Oh, thank you so much for you folks participating in this important political activity, and thank you. And he signed my program, and did I save it? No.
So he was actually at WSU.
Yeah.
Wow, I didn't know
And
that.
in fact, I think that yearbook that year, there's got his picture, and I'm in the shadow in the background of it or something. But I didn't save that program. It had his signature on it. He signed them all. And so then, years later, he's president, and I'm in 762 building in the K Reactor Design Group. And right next to my office was the resident office of the FBI. And so I probably knew it among the first 3 or 4 at Hanford that Kennedy had been shot. Because they came over, and it was, we knew the FBI guys, and they knew us, and I could stand in their doorway and listen to their radio chatter, and of course we assembled in the hallway and to try and learn what was happening from the FBI chatter coming in on the radio. And that was the whole story that was just emerging on the national news.
Right.
So kind of a close couple path crossings there.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Thank you. I think that'd be the most detailed, one of the more detailed Kennedy visit stories I've ever got.
Yeah.
Or from
Yeah.
the interview. And so I guess in closing,
in fact, the neighbor down the street from me was a fellow named Swede Holmquist, who was safety director for all of Hanford under DuPont GE, appointed by Matthias to be safety director.
Oh, wow.
And he brought home a lot of stuff when he retired, which I have some of it now, which you'll get someday. But in the meantime, I'm going to enjoy it,
Sure.
including the press release notebook on the Kennedy visit.
Oh, wow.
Thick notebook.
Wow. So in closing, what would you like future generations to know about working at Hanford during the Cold War?
Well, it was serious business. And I took it that way. I had a very high security clearance. I took it serious. I've had the opportunity to talk to students in the university environments. This is my advice to them. If you get involved in either corporate security activity or government security activity, take it serious. I did. And there's stuff I couldn't tell you today that I was involved in. Mostly, interestingly enough, on manufacturing technology. One time, the highest level security thing we had at Hanford was production rate. You can read about it in paper right now, how many devices we made. I wouldn't have dared told you that in the 60s.
Sure. But that manufacturing technology, though, is still very much...
Yeah.
Because of the danger of...
Yeah. People picking up on how to do it.
Yeah.
And even though what we did 50 years ago is probably different than what they do today, I was down at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, a month ago, and I met a fellow that was doing the laser work on the stockpile proof of reliability, and he knew where I'd come from. I've been through the whole the whole test site, and they took their job serious too. But there's been more released on what they did than ever will be released on what Hanford did. Mm. And yet even I meet people around the country, everybody knows about Oak Ridge. Not very many people know what happened at Hanford. And I think it's an important thing to tell, and this is why I'm excited about seeing the B reactor elevated. And I go so far as to include the other facilities tea plant's an important part of the whole story.
Oh, sure. I mean, it doesn't, the fuel doesn't pop out of V reactor and then just go to Los Alamos.
In fact, I had, when I was plant engineering manager, one thing Rockwell did when they first came to town, there were 7 people, and I've got a picture of all 7 of them, that had like 35 years of total experience back to DuPont. And they were all given a Rockwell 35-year gold watch. 2 of them worked for my group. One of them was kind of a simple story. He worked at DuPont at Salt Lake, came up to Hanford. The other had an amazing story. And I held a staff meeting when I gave out these 2 watches to the people. I had all my people and anybody else who wanted to come. And I said, Max Yates, I want you to, he did not know what I was going to do. He says, I want you to tell us all where you were at a certain date, 1942 or 3, like that. I didn't know you knew that date. Well, I know the whole story, and you're going to tell us right now what happened that day and forth. Well, I haven't talked about that much. Well, you can tell it, or I'll tell it, because I know it. And he said, okay. I went to work for Remington Arms in Kansas City. Was in charge of tooling. Machinist background, mechanical engineering graduate. And one day I was called into the boss's office and told I was selected for a special corporate assignment. They knew nothing about it. I was supposed to take it. What do you want to do? And he said, I don't know. I guess I'll take it. What would you do? You were a kid out of school. Worked for 6 months for DuPont. Yeah. So he said, here's an envelope. Open it when you get home. You're off. Now go home. Got home, told his wife, new wife, opened the envelope, report to Dr. Dew, University of Chicago, tomorrow, 2 days. Dr. Dew was code name for Fermi. He went into Fermi's office and said, go to that meeting room, got some other people, will come in and talk. He learned the whole story of what was going to happen. And his mission in being taken into Chicago was he worked on making the fuel for the Chicago pile.
Wow.
And then there were 6 of them sent from Chicago to Hanford, and he was project manager on construction of B plant, not the reactor, but the fuel separations plant. And his whole career, he stayed as a senior, strong individual contributor, including working for me 40 years later.
Wow. That's quite a story.
And that's never documented any place.
Yeah, the plants seem to really suffer from a lack of documentation and just awareness. I think the reactors get all of the...
Yeah. And, you know, he'd been a wonderful person to have had in your interview session, see? So I can tell a story about him now. But... and all that came out as a result of Rockwell saying, we want to do something for the old-timers that are here. And they selected, it happened that they had some gold watches that said Rockwell on them. And then they had them all in I gave the watches out at my own staff meeting, but then later they all assembled in the famous Purex conference room for a group picture.
Oh, wow.
And I went with them on that. I've got a copy of that picture with the 7 people.
That's really neat. Well, Dennis, thank you so much. It's been a really great interview.
Well, I could probably talk for an hour and 2 hours. I'm not getting hoarse here, but I enjoy the history. I think you know that Don Sorensen and I both kind of partner in researching what we can. He's 2 light years ahead of me, and yet I got stuff he'd enjoy having, and I kind of got hooked on it when I cleaned out Sweet Homecook's house. I wish I'd have saved more, but unfortunately he had brought home boxes full of historical papers, put them in his basement under a window where the sprinklers were running, and I opened up these boxes and they were all moldy, and I didn't want to kill myself, including a big thick white binder on the collapse of the second Purex tunnel.
Oh, wow.
I opened it, looked at the pictures, and threw it in the dumpster.
Yeah, that's...
And that was the only one that existed.
Wow.
And yet that report might be in the library someplace. But it's so hard to find stuff in the library. Don's got access to more pictures. He's got thousands of pictures. And his son collects pictures of Richland.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of an interesting tie.
Yeah, his vintage Tri-Cities Facebook I think was just in the paper the other day.
Yeah.
He likes a lot of our Facebook posts. That's when I first found out about him.
And yet I've got some safety plaques that I've got one 1944 from the National Safety Council to the Hanford, 1944, and I got 1945. I've got 3 bronze plaques that Holmquist lugged home, and I've got one that Kennedy gave at site. In fact, have you been to the Nevada Test Site Museum?
I have not.
Worthwhile going. See what they've done there. I'll sign your travel authorization if you want to go.
Okay.
It won't mean much when the dollars come, but I've been there a number of times. And in fact, I went again when I was the student conference I put on in University of Nevada. In the afternoon was quiet. I go over to the museum. Well, on an earlier visit, I'm standing inside the library. They've got a public reading room in addition to the museum tour. And they've got this plaque hanging there. John F. Kennedy presents to the Atomic Energy Commission sites. Dosant walks up to me and said, "Isn't that neat? Have you ever seen one of those?" And I said, "Yeah, I got one hanging just like it in my room." "Oh, you do?" I suspect it was a case where one had been given to each site.
Yeah.
And so probably half a dozen of those exist. I might have one of 2 that remain. I don't know if Oak Ridges still exists. But these bronze ones, you'll get them someday. But in the meantime, I offered to give Connie a couple of them once, and I said, only one condition: you hang it in the museum. If it's going to go in a file cabinet, you can't have it. And of course, you're well aware museums don't take things with conditions.
It's true.
Unless it's a loan to special purpose, so it's still hanging in my room.
Well, Dennis, if you think of things later on that you'll talk about, we'd be happy to schedule another interview with you.
Or if my experience might be even more broad than a lot of other folks. So if you get into an area where you want to amplify something, I'm on recall. I'm happy to do it for you, because I think preserving the history is critical to the good work that so many thousands of people did at Hanford. And I've had the pleasure of meeting Paul Tibbets and probably half a dozen of the crew of the first missions. And every one of them say the same story. People ask them, "Would you do it again?" And the answer is, we were young Army officers, we were described a problem, we saluted and we did it. It wasn't our position to challenge it. And I kind of feel the same way, having been involved in production at Hanford. Didn't bother me. I participated in making many thousands of warheads. We only used a few of them, and those are the ones I know got shot down at Nevada. And I learned later which ones got shot, because in my last year or so, I was, by, I guess, seniority, I was declared to be the authorized shipper of the final product out of Hanford. And so every one of the shipments, including, I remember one time the couriers would show up at the back door of 234.5. We're here to take today's shipment. Okay. sign here, and you got them, see. So they got sent down to Rocky Flats on a railroad car. They had a code name Redwood car. It was always kind of parked up in the west area shop area. Nobody knew what it was unless you knew what it was. It was a U.S. mail car. It was painted just U.S. mail, no entry. I said to one of the couriers, hey, I want to see the inside of your rail car. Oh, yeah, come on up, no problem. Oh, I'll be up. So he took off with the load, and I went and got a car and took off, and I got to be in the vault there that was normally off limits to GE people. Wow. And they closed the door, and the guy'd sit in each end of it with a machine gun, and off they went to Rocky Flats on a rail car.
Wow. Crazy. Well,
so anyway, those are fun little stories. I could probably have 1,000 more, but I had fun doing my career, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat. I really would.
Good. Well, Dennis, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for putting the time into it and the effort, and I think it's a good program.
Well, good. Thank you. Thank you for